Hello, good morning, and welcome to one more edition of Crítica e Romance. This is our lecture series from the Department of English and German, and in partnership with the Department of Comparative Literature. So today we're here with Adriana Jacobs and Claire Williams, we're going to talk about Clarice Lispector and the international reception of Clarice Lispector in the 21st century, which is the theme of their newest book, which is to come out next year with Legenda and MHRA, right? So before our guests begin their talks, I'm going to introduce them. So Adriana Jacobs is Associate Professor of Modern Hebrew Literature at the University of Oxford and author of Strange Cocktail, Translation and the Making of Modern Hebrew Poetry, which came out with University of Michigan Press in 2018. Her work on contemporary Hebrew and Israeli poetry and translation has appeared in various publications, including Shofar, PMLA, Studies in American Jewish Literature, and Proof Texts. She's the recipient of a 2015 Penheim Translation Fund grant for her translation of Van Nguyen's, I'm sorry, I don't know if I can pronounce that correctly, The Truffle Eye, published this year by Zephyr Press. With Claire Williams, she's co-editor of After Clarice, Reading Lispector's Legacy in the 21st Century, which is forthcoming with Legenda Press. And today Adriana is going to present Clarice hebraica, which she will talk a little bit about Clarice and I imagine her translation into Hebrew. And we also have here Claire Williams, who is Associate Professor of Brazilian Literature and Culture at the University of Oxford. Her research focuses on women's writing, minority writing, and life writing from the Lusophone world. Publications on Clarice Lispector include The Encounter Between Opposites in the Works of Clarice Lispector, which was published in 2006, and After Clarice, Reading Lispector's Legacy in the 21st Century, which she co-edited with Adriana Jacobs. She also coordinated Entrevistas, a selection of Lispector's interviews, which came out with Editora Rocco in 2007. Adriana and Claire, thank you so much for being here today, and thank you for accepting our invitation. We're really glad to have you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much, Julia.
So the floor is yours, Adriana.
Okay. So I'll start. So maybe one question some of the attendees may be asking themselves is how someone who's an associate professor of modern Hebrew literature gets involved with a book project involving the Brazilian Jewish writer Clarice Lispector. And the reality is that even though I don't work on Portuguese, the work of Clarice has been hugely influential in both in inspiring me to pursue literary studies and also just as someone who's learned a great deal from her work, both about literature and life. And Claire and I connected over our mutual adoration of Clarice Lispector's work and had the idea of organizing an international conference that would sort of allow for kind of a reappraisal of her work and to consider the role of translation in disseminating her work broadly. And for me personally, given my own research interests, I wanted to give a platform to scholars in Israel who work on Lispector's work, to her Hebrew translators, and to think maybe more broadly about how to fit the Middle East into considerations of the reception of her work internationally, and also to rethink a bit about the whole the question of, the role of Judaism or the place of Judaism in her work, which leads me to my particular contribution to the volume, which is a close reading of the translation of a specific word from Portuguese into Hebrew in the Hebrew translation of Aura de Estrela, and which was translated into Hebrew as Sheat HaKochav, and I'll say a little more about it in my talk. But I actually started that chapter with her tombstone. And that might be an unusual place to start, but I'm going to now start with my prepared written remarks, which will give you a kind of preview of how my chapter unfolds. So I begin with Clarice hebraica. So Clarice Lispector is buried in the Cementerio Comunal Israelita Jewish Communal Cemetery of Caju in Rio de Janeiro. Pictured above, sorry, it's not pictured above because that's in my chapter. So basically pictured, the chapter opens with a picture of the gravestone, which unfortunately I can't share with you today. And you see on her gravestone on the top, there's the Magen David, the Star of David, which is a traditional symbol of Judaism. And then you also see the Hebrew letters Pe and Nun, so P and N. And that's an abbreviation for Po Nitmana, which means here is buried. And then there's another line of Hebrew text, Haya bat Pinchas, Haya, daughter of Pinchas. So the death records the date of her death according to the Jewish calendar, along with the corresponding date on the Gregorian calendar. So for those of you who are familiar with her life, she died on December 9th, 1977. And at the foot of the gravestone, there's a quotation in Portuguese from her 1964 novel, The Passion According to G.H. So the Hebrew text is what interests me here, and I'm going to say a little bit about this. So the Hebrew text on the gravestone draws us into her Jewish genealogy. And this is a kind of history that remained largely out of public view for much of her life. In his biography of Lispector, Benjamin Moser even goes as far as to refer to the name Chaya as her hidden name, as if it were some kind of secret. But Lispector's gravestone and the way the Hebrew and Portuguese texts share this space complicate this assessment. So Lispector may have refrained from addressing her Jewish identity in public fora, but it wasn't uncommon for Jewish immigrants in Brazil and elsewhere in this period to adopt a new name that better assimilated to the hegemonic language of their country of arrival. So for instance, Pinchas, her father, became Pedro. While continuing to use and so they would do this while continuing to use their Hebrew names, or sometimes their names were Yiddish or Ladino names, in Jewish religious and ceremonial contexts. And this kind of practice of moving between your more Jewish name, you could say, and this adopted name would have been consistent with the internal diglossia that was characteristic of diasporic Jewish communities in the early to mid 20th century. So Lispector died on a Friday, and her body was cleansed according to Jewish ritual, and it lay in state in a small chapel at the cemetery until Sunday, December 11th. So usually in Judaism, traditionally, bodies are buried very soon after death. There's not the sort of practice of waiting many days. So because she died on a Friday, she couldn't be buried on a Saturday, which is the Jewish Sabbath. So she was buried on Sunday, just another detail that I find interesting here. So on December 11th, she's buried, and in the description of her funeral that appeared in the Brazilian daily Folha de Sao Paulo, and forgive me, my pronunciation of Portuguese is influenced mostly by my speaking of Spanish. So if I do what you call it, portuñol, just forgive me. So this passage stood out, and I'll read it in English. In the oratory at 11 a.m. sharp, the rabbi's proxy, Yosef Aronson, began the liturgy by reciting in Aramaic Psalm 91 of the Old Testament, followed by songs in Hebrew and reading, now in Portuguese, some psalms. There, before the casket was taken to the grave, Yosef Aronson bid farewell to the body, praying, El Maleh Rachamim. At the graveside, he stood next to Paolo Gurgel Valenci, and recited the Kaddish, the funeral prayer, while final respects were paid to Clarice Lispector with the throwing of 3 spadeful of dirt over her casket, representing the fact that from dust you came, to dust you shall return. The ceremony came to a close with the rabbi's proxy requesting that everyone present turn to the right towards the east in the direction of Jerusalem. So I just love this description. It's so detailed and really brings to light kind of all the different sort of Jewish texts and and practices and rituals that go into preparing someone for burial in Jewish tradition. So the Jewish congregation to which the Lispector family was affiliated was headed by the Rabbi Enrique Lemle, who was affiliated with what's known as Reform Judaism, so a more progressive, liberal observance of Judaism. And he was actually committed to translating Jewish liturgy into Portuguese. So it's not surprising that Lispector's funeral featured liturgy in traditional Jewish languages like Hebrew and Aramaic, as well as the adopted language of Brazil's Jewish population, Portuguese. So in addition to members of the Jewish community of Rio, you also had among the 200 people present, the Brazilian writers Rubem Braga, Fernando Sabino, Nélida Pinhon, José Rubem Fonseca, as well as their family friend Vasco Leitão da Cunha. And so from these details, it's clear that the funeral was a Jewish funeral in a way that made it clear that the Lispector family was intimately integrated in Rio's Jewish community. And news reports about the funeral also gave the public a glimpse into Lispector's Jewish background to a degree that surpassed the one that she offered in real life. But it also underscored, as Carlos Mendes de Sousa has observed, and I'm going to quote him in English, now death would also end up at the mercy of appropriations and contradictory myth-making movements, end quote. Separately, a group of Lispector's friends, as well as her publishers, organized a Catholic Mass in her name, which took place in December 15. According to her friend Nélida Pinhon, Olga Borelli, who was Lispector's assistant and confidant, relayed in a private conversation that Lispector had wanted a Christian burial as proof of her conversion. The friends decided, though, against raising this issue with Lispector's family, and so the family's plans for a traditional Jewish burial moved forward. But so it's interesting to consider to what extent would Lispector have wanted this very Jewish funeral? How much of this was really the influence of her family deciding on how her death would be honored and marked. But what interests me is the inclusion of Chaya on her gravestone in these Hebrew letters, because to me it sort of acknowledges the role that the Hebrew name plays in the Jewish life cycle. And I want to say a few words about that because I think it's important here. So children receive their Hebrew name, male children, at their circumcision ceremony, or a name blessing if the child is a girl. This Hebrew name also appears in your Jewish marriage certificate, which is called the ketubah, and also in divorce documents. And it's by your Hebrew name that Jewish congregants are called up to recite a blessing before the reading of the Torah. And during the memorial prayer, which is recited 4 times a year, the Hebrew name of the deceased is recited along with their father's name in Ashkenazi or Western European Jewish traditions. And in times of illness, prayers for the sick also include one's Hebrew name. And I raise these details just to call attention to the cultural work that Hebrew is doing on this gravestone, adjacent to, but also apart from and distinct from the Portuguese. So if it is indeed the case that Lispector, towards the end of her life or throughout her life, identified more with Christianity than Judaism, even going so far as to convert perhaps, the Jewish funeral and Jewish gravestone insist on asserting Lispector's Jewish identity in Ha'olam Haba, which is Hebrew for the world to come, or the Jewish afterlife. When Arison performs the traditional Jewish funeral prayer, El Maleh Rachamim, which means God full of mercy, there's a discernible shift from this Hebrew to Portuguese when he names the deceased. And I want to say there used to be on YouTube a recording of Aronson reading this part, which went offline. So I'll try to recreate it for you, but it's really fascinating just to note the shift between the kind of Hebrew sounds and more Portuguese sounds. So when he says it, he says, Chaya bas pinchos, Clarice Lispector she'alha le'olama. And so this shift isn't just linguistic. So like the interplay between the Hebrew and Portuguese on the tombstone, Aronson's voice marks a movement between the cultural and historical context that each language encompasses. The result isn't a seamless movement between these languages, but a clear collision of their distinct script worlds. So when you hear Chaya bach pinchos, just the soundscape is completely distinct from Clarice Lispector. David Damrosch, who popularized the term script world in a series of articles published in the last decade, has called attention to the role of script in the circulation and translation of text from ancient times to the present day. I quote from one of Damrosch's articles, learning a script, one absorbs key elements of a broad literary history, its terms of reference, habits of style, and poetics, often transcending those of any one language or country. The Latin, end quote. The Latin script, for example, has been used by a number of languages and across long stretches of human history. And in his own study on script, Damrosch cites the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Old Norse sagas as examples of texts that have come to influence a wide range of literary cultures in the Latin script world via translation or adaptation. But the hegemonic status of the Latin script world can and has occluded the multiple linguistic worlds that comprise it. And this is a reality that So-Won Park acknowledges when she describes the script world as a, quote, many-layered, overlapping complex of multiple linguistic, political, and cultural systems, end quote. Park's work in particular highlights shifts in power and cultural capital as texts translate from one script world to another, as well as within a script world. So the work of Damrosch and Park has prompted me to consider how the Hebrew translation of Lispector carries with it, in the square letters of the Hebrew alphabet, whole complexes of values, assumptions, and traditions that have formed the history of this language in this script. So if you can pull up the cover image again, if possible. There we go. Okay. So in my contribution to this volume, I delved into the Hebrew translation of Lispector's celebrated novella, Ahora da Estrella, and which was published in Hebrew translation, and you can see the cover here, in 1999 as She'ata Kochav, in a translation by Miriam Tivon, who is a prolific translator of Portuguese and French literature in Hebrew. You'll also notice, though, well, if you can read Hebrew, you can see it's actually, it was published in a volume that also included Laços de Familia, so which was translated into Hebrew as Kishrei Mishpacha. And so the Hour of the Star appears at the end of that volume. But there's the cover, and this was a book that I encountered when I came to Israel for the first time soon after I arrived in 1998, and the next year I found this book in the bookstore and I quickly picked it up, even though at the time I could barely read Hebrew. All right, so we can pull off that cover now. Thank you. So for those of you who are familiar with this novel, we follow a sort of disenfranchised protagonist named Maccabea, who lives a very impoverished and difficult life. But throughout the novella, we observe her experiencing moments of grace and beauty. And she also cuts a bit of a tragic figure at the end. So, so the name Maccabea is arguably the most explicit Jewish reference in this book, if not in Lispector's oeuvre as a whole. We don't find a great deal of explicit Jewish references in Lispector's writing. But reading The Hour of the Star in Hebrew, I'm drawn to the ways that the Hebrew language itself opens up the possibility of a different kind of Jewish reading. And in my chapter, I offer an exegesis on Pivon's translation of the Portuguese piedade, mercy or pity, a word that appears many times throughout the novel. And Pivon translates, sorry, I've lost my spot. Pivon translates Lispector's piedade as the Hebrew rachamim, which is typically translated into English as pity, compassion, or mercy. And in the novella, Lispector critiques the limits and failures of piedade in the context of Brazilian society and its religious landscape, where Catholicism predominates. But when piedade is translated into the Hebrew rachamim, a Jewish ethical reading also emerges. In the Talmud, which is a collection of Jewish commentary, the set of which form the basis of Jewish law, God is frequently referred to as rachamana, which is Aramaic for compassionate. In Psalm 103, we get a description of God's relationship to human beings as a compassionate parent to a child. So in Hebrew, kirachem av al banim, as a father has compassion for his children. There's also a maternal association inherent in the word rachamim, because it shares a root with the word rechem, which means womb. And this theological intimacy is particularly poignant in relation to Ahora da Estrella, given the attention paid to Macabea's body and the repeated affirmations that she's a virgin and will die a virgin. And at the end of the book, the narrator even considers writing her out like, quote, murdering an infant child. So according to the Talmud, to be compassionate is one of the three distinguishing marks of the Jewish people. In the exegetical work, the Midrash, in one of the books on a commentary on Genesis, we get the teaching that God created the earth with midat hadin, a measure of principle of judgment, and midat harachamim, a principle of compassion. So God is considered merciful and has bestowed this attribute on the Jewish people. And so to be without compassion or without rachamim means that you are unfit to be part of the Jewish people. And in Ashkenazi Jewish tradition, the prayer El Maleh Rachamim, which you might remember was part of the funeral description. This is what the cantor Yosef Aronson, he's described as reciting this prayer. This particular prayer, El Maleh Rachamim, is dedicated to the souls of the dead, and it's usually recited during a funeral service or on the anniversary of a relative's death. And even though we don't know the exact dating of this prayer in its current form, it goes back to the early 17th century when it was recited among European Jewish communities as a prayer for victims of anti-Jewish violence. And this prayer asks that the soul of the dead be granted a proper rest. And underlying this request is the belief that souls are not guaranteed this rest in the world to come, in the afterlife. In order to guarantee this, it really relies on one's own achievements in life. And that sort of determines the quality of the proper rest that you receive in the world to come. But it also relies on those who remain in the world of the living and continue to send their prayers and good deeds towards the dead. So this prayer makes this explicit in its request that the one praying the prayer contribute, and I'm quoting from the prayer, contribute to charity in remembrance of the departed one's soul. So it's kind of like a cosmic ledger where every prayer indeed is taken into account and determines the kind of rest that the dead have in the world to come. So in my chapter, I go through various passages where we encounter the word piedade and how the word piedade is working within more of a Christian context in the Portuguese version, and then how in the translation into Hebrew, we get more of what I would argue is of Jewish ethical reading. Of course, this is not something that necessarily Lispector would have been aiming for or anticipated. I don't know if she had Hebrew translation in the horizon. It's just the kind of thing that happens when a work is translated. And that's something that is interested us in putting this book together, and we can talk more about it in the Q&A, is to really think about what's happening when her work is translated into another language and into other scripts like Hebrew, Chinese. I've learned that there's an Arabic translation of The Hour of the Star that came out a few years ago. And once that kind of translation happens, her work moves and circulates in very distinct ethical and theological contexts. And so Lispector may have resisted a Jewish reading of her work and of her own life, but the Hebrew translation nonetheless activates religious and cultural relations that in her own life and writing remained vaguely articulated. And yet, as I try to show in this chapter, and I've tried to give you a preview of it in this talk, translation into modern Hebrew draws her text into the orbit of Jewish textual tradition, revealing, but as likely inventing, Jewish sites and echoes in her work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adriana. This was a very interesting contribution. And yeah, I already have a few questions, but we'll leave them for the end. So I'm going to get Claire into the studio. There you go. Not into the studio, onto the screen, this virtual world. So thank you so much for your talk, Adriana. So we'll come back afterwards so we can have, we can get questions from our viewers and also discuss a little bit of your talks together, okay? Oops, sorry, Chag. I accidentally added him. Okay, so Claire, I'm going to, wait, let me share your slides now. I'm a bit slow with technology, so bear with me. There you go. Oh, add to stream. Okay, now I got it. Thank you, Claire. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Julia. Can you start the slideshow on the title page? And it's a great pleasure to be here this afternoon to see my dear co-editor, who is on a different continent. Every now and then we meet up for editorial meetings, but it's great to see you, Adriana. And also Julia, who has admitted to say that, in fact, she has contributed a wonderful chapter to our book about biographies of Clarice Lispector. And that's been one of the pleasures of this edited volume, is that we've brought together not just literary critics, but translators, specialists in translation studies, musicians. We've talked about the film version of The Hour of the Star. We've tried to bring people from different backgrounds, different countries, and we're just very excited about the book, which will come out next year, we hope. So, Julia, can you expand the PowerPoint so that the slide shows the first one? Okay, we can leave it like that. That's fine. That's fine. Okay. So I'm going to read from my selected pieces of my chapter, and I'm looking at the literary afterlives of Clarice Lispector. Having studied her for many years now, I've collected stories, portraits, all sorts of ephemera and merchandising to do with her face on, or with quotations of her, and this book seemed like a good place to analyze this material, the literary material. And initially, I wrote an enormous chapter because I wanted to write about everything that I had discovered. But of course, that wasn't possible. And Adriana luckily said to me, "Why don't you why don't you split it in half? And indeed I did. And of the texts that I'd collected, a lot of them had featured Clarice Lispector, the real person, as a character, imagining her in certain situations, and others talked about readers of Clarice reading her work, creating a relationship with that. So I split those two, and now I'm going to talk about a selection of these texts. Okay, so that's a picture of Clarice at the end of her life, which was part of that amazing exhibition that took place in Sao Paulo and travelled to Lisbon. And I'm going to ask you, please, Julia, to pass on to the next slide. That's it. If you could put it onto, yeah, tela inteira, to try and make it bigger, or you could, because you can see my. It's fine, as long as you can see the quotations. So, ao que parece, venho trabalhando muito desde que desencarnei. This sarcastic comment. Oh, lost my. This sarcastic comment was purportedly made by Brazilian author Clarice Lispector in 2009, decades after her death. In a book review, From Beyond the Grave, the author, in truth Portuguese-Angolan novelist José Eduardo Agualusa, expresses her perplexed reaction to the publication of Benjamin Moses' biography. Perplexed because she considers that, in contrast to the potential effects of her fiction, uma biografia não me resgata, não me explica. Her surprise at being so busy, despite not having a body, I think alludes to Moses' assertion that she frequently speaks to the living through mediums and spiritists. Nonetheless, it can equally be applied to the number of spectral Clarices brought to life since her death in 1977 in over 20 texts of varying lengths and styles, what I'd like to call Lispector's literary afterlives. Writers from around the world have channeled their responses to Lispector's life and work into literary representations of the writer, varying from a vague presence to imaginary dialogues with her, from creative reconstructions of events documented in or tantalizingly absent from biographies or literary texts, to characters clearly based on her life story. And she led an extraordinary and eventful life, travelled the world, she was a pioneer in the careers that she chose, and she knew great joy and great tragedy. And there was at one point a rumour circulating on the internet that Meryl Streep was going to play her in a biopic. The original Clarice Lispector died in 1977, but she keeps coming back to life in literary form. Though some of these spectral portraits take liberties with recorded facts, I think that the Clarices they imagine complement the existing biographies and critical materials in unexpected ways, also drawing out nuances present in her writing. They tell us how others understand her legacy, and they may even act as examples of that legacy, putting into practice the audacity to express oneself in writing, challenge conventions, and overflow rigid categorizations. They also manifest more widely ways of thinking about the relationship between author and text, fact and fiction, history and literature, life and death. And they can also be seen to reflect developments in biographical writing and theories about life writing over a 40-year period. As it becomes more metabiographical or experimental, it moves further and further from the idea that a definitive biography can be achieved. Can you move to the next slide, please? Thank you. They were just some examples of how Clarice is a consecrated writer and examples of her legacy in material form as statues and on the stamp, which came out in 2020, celebrating her centenary. Can you move to the next slide, please? Okay, so a quotation here. I find this Abigail Derecho's concept of archontic literature, taken from the archontic principle postulated by Jacques Derrida in his article on archive fever. I find that this concept useful here to describe the way certain entities and bodies of work attract fans and compel admirers to engage with and expand upon them. In her words, archontic texts are not delimited properties with definite borders that can be transgressed. So all texts that build on a previously existing text are not lesser than the source text. Rather, they only add to the text's archive, becoming a part of the archive and expanding it. An archontic text allows or even invites writers to enter it, select specific items they find useful, make new artifacts using those found objects, and deposit the newly made work back into the source text's archive. Next slide, please. Lispector's archive certainly allows and invites readers in. It now includes biographical and anecdotal material and literary criticism, but also caricatures, film, theatre, dance adaptations, and anthologies of short stories like Extratextos, Personagens reescritas, I put it on the slide as well, in which authors from the Portuguese-speaking world reimagine Lispector's characters. But it also includes Lispector para crianças. It includes Teresa Montero's guided tour around Rio, Como Clarice Lispector pode mudar sua vida, the commemorative collections Feliz Aniversário Clarice and Marias e Clarices, which came out to celebrate the centenary last year, and even republishing Elisa Lispector's novel No Exílio. So these are works which have been published that add to the archive. Now, the Afterlives which I'm looking at take the form of poems, impressionistic sketches, short stories, and even fully fledged novels. I'll try to give you a flavour of the range and breadth by looking at a few of them more closely. And I'm sure that there are many more. I've only been able to access the ones in the languages which I speak, but there must be something in German, there may be something in Italian, there must be something in other languages. And if anybody discovers any short stories in which Clarice features as a character, or whether which reference her work, I'd be very, very grateful to hear about them. So firstly, texts in which Clarice appears as a character. These portraits respect the biographical facts or build upon personal reminiscences to recreate or imagine the author at particular moments during her lifetime. Clarice Lispector's last words, spoken from her hospital bed before she lapsed into a coma, enigmatically blur life and literature. She's reported to have said, "Você matou meu personagem." It's impossible to know for sure what she was thinking as she crossed the boundary between life and death and became a memory, a legend, and a character. And since then, she has been reincarnated in multiple ways, perhaps too many. Vilma Areias's 2005 book of essays on the works of Clarice begins with the concern that not only is her friend's work losing its originality through overreading, but that her identity is becoming blurred. And I have a quotation on the next slide, please. Ninguém duvida de que nos dias de hoje haja tantas Clarices como se queira, não só como objeto de estudo, mas também como modelo para o traçado de retratos ou trajetórias intelectuais ou espirituais. Por isso, às vezes, penso que é tarde demais, ou ao contrário, muito cedo para escrever sobre ela. No primeiro caso, porque grandes textos já foram publicados, e no segundo, porque os ofícios celebrativos que a cada dia recobrem essa obra exigem um tempo de espera a fim de que ela possa de novo surgir em sua indiscutível e humana originalidade. The following portraits of Lispector respect the biographical facts or build upon personal reminiscences to recreate or imagine the author during her lifetime or as a spirit with whom the narrator and or characters dialogue, or as a benevolent ghostly presence. And that's where the spectres of the title come from. Texts written by close personal friends do shed new light on her character and behavior, off-duty and relaxed, cheerful and comic, disproving some myths but reasserting others. And texts which use Lispector's biography as a template for the life and activities of a character living in the present provide an interesting parallel. Author and academic Vilma Areias is one of the fiercest protectors of Lispector's life and work, fearful that the real person, and more importantly, the originality of the work, are lost among the sheer volume of critical readings and growing number of biographical accounts. Can you move on to the next slide, please? That's it. Her short story, Sobre os Espelhos, from 1992, from a Jabuti prize-winning collection, describes Lispector's bearing and presence with some unexpected metaphors, and it emphasizes the initial discomforting impact of meeting her and the challenge of being her friend. Clarice é uma unha clara, espinho na planta do pé. Nunca mais andei direito desde que vi Clarice. Ela passou e, tarde demais, meu coração rolou. Mas não olhei para trás nem uma vez. Encontro Clarice e digo coisas sem nexo, porque ela pode ser uma flor quando quer, mas também uma mulher bruta, com rodelas de suor debaixo do braço, mastigando a coxa gorda de uma galinha aos golinhos de chope. Não é nenhum segredo que comeria carne humana, se necessário. That's rather an unexpected version of Clarice. And yet, for all the pain and panic she causes the narrator, she also inspires loyalty and devotion. The story evokes the intimacy between them through images and anecdotes. Their relationship's very close, so close that the narrator is overwhelmed by Clarice, even as the latter lies on her deathbed. Olhei no espelho, mas em vez do meu, vi seu rosto amarrado de fios sobre o travesseiro. Areias' iconoclastic story emphasizes the physicality of the female body and playful friendship, empathy represented through the mirroring effect, rather than describing her subject's intangible, intellectual or mystical qualities. Authors who have not had the privilege of meeting Lispector in real life have had to rely on evidence recorded in biographical material, been obliged to use her writing as a primary source, or chosen to exercise their imaginations to produce literature that we might call historiographic metafiction. The works created may transpose a life story to another setting at one extreme, or speculate about unknown elements or events in writers' lives in order to compose plausible outcomes appropriate to the context, or even imagine what might have happened if they had made other choices or had alternative opportunities and encountered different people and places. Lispector is indeed a writer with legions of fans and devoted readers, but only a few of them have gone as far as to publish fiction about her, her characters, or her plot lines. She inspires deep feelings of empathy and empowerment, but also awe and a kind of anxiety of influence that seems to prevent most of them from writing about or like her. I have found two chronicles, one by José Eduardo Agualusa, with which I began my talk, in which authors dare to write as Clarice. Maybe it's not a coincidence that they're both men. One way to sidestep the issue of getting too close to one's idol has been to hide her behind a many-layered disguise. And the two authors who have attempted this both chose to do it in novel-length texts. US author and poet Adriana X in Ways to Disappear from 2016, her comic novel about a translator who knows her author so well she's able to solve the mystery of her disappearance, and Chilean author Carla Gelfenbein's Alfaguara Prize-winning whodunit Contigo en la Distancia, In the Distance with You from 2015. And that's on my next slide. A quotation from Gelfenbein. So there she is. In the latter, in Gelfenbein's novel, Vera Sigal, a secondary though pivotal character, is based on Clarice Lispector. There are numerous historical, physical and literary correspondences between Vera's life and Lispector's. The family's flight from the Ukraine, a portrait by George Chirico, her French re. The link is made explicit. And in a short afterword, Gelfenbein explains that Lispector's life is interwoven with Vera Sigal's and my own, and she acknowledges her debt to the Moser biography. Already a passionate reader of Lispector's work since her student days, Gelfenbein only realized the parallels between Lispector's family background and her own upon reading the 2009 biography. The background shared by Vera and Lispector enables Gelfenbein to introduce episodes which show anti-Semitism among the Santiago elite, as well as the rootlessness felt by characters caught between different cultures. Like Novi's novel, it portrays the literary and publishing worlds in mid-20th century and the difficulties, particularly for women, to establish a literary career. And yet, despite the similarities in their pasts, Gelfenbein grants Vera a healthy and active old age into the 21st century. She has grandchildren, a great inspirational love affair, and the opportunity to reap the benefits of her literary success in a democratic country, none of which Lispector, who died at the age of 56, while Brazil was still under a military dictatorship, was able to enjoy. And interestingly, in both the texts I've just discussed, the Lispector figure is silent or absent. Vera, for much of the narrative, most of the narrative, is in a coma, attainable only through others' memories and testimonies. And that's where the quotation comes from. A new Vera had emerged in Infante's words, a woman of flesh and blood, but a woman who at the same time opened up new mysteries. Try as he might, Infante hadn't ever managed to pierce the shell she lived inside, which made her inaccessible for everyone, maybe even for herself. Vera in her coma is present and alive, but silent and distant, perhaps evoking the spirit of Clarice Lispector hovering over the novel. She may not speak, but her influence is felt by all the characters who become better people through reading her. In the rest of this presentation, I'd like to mention texts in which Lispector's presence is more abstract and the emphasis falls on the reader's reactions to her writing and the subsequent feelings of indebtedness, but also frustration. In these prosopopeic texts, she takes the form of a benevolent spirit, overseeing and blessing their work rather than a character within it, although she sometimes becomes so real that when they evoke her, she answers back. Firstly, the earliest example I could find of a Lispector literary afterlife. Canadian literary critic Marie-Ange Despierres' collection of short poetic fragments, Dire oui à Clarice Lispector, was published in 1989. And that's next on the next slide, please. That's it. And I couldn't find on the internet, I couldn't find a picture of the cover, so I'll show you the cover, which is quite, there's quite a beautiful picture at the bottom, funny little picture. So this, from 1989, Despierres dialogues with quotations from the Brazilian writer's works and expresses awe and gratitude at what they have taught, shown, revealed to her and enabled her to write. L'écriture de Clarice me projette dans la joie. En lisant Clarice, j'écris. Je trace une voie un sillon dans la parole. Le regard de Clarice m'accompagne dans ma découverte. Je perçois l'état brut des choses, comme la rose regardée par Clarice. Reading Clarice becomes a turning point in her life. There is a before and an after. Her emotional, enthusiastic appreciation of Lispector's writing is not at all uncommon and has parallels with Hélène Cixous's rhapsodic close readings and interpretations. But the spectre of Clarice is most vivid perhaps when she appears to Nadila, the narrator and protagonist of Soy una caja by Natalia Carrero, a Catalan writer writing in Spanish. This text is hard to categorize, incorporating autobiography, biography, research, diary, and literary criticism, but the underlying plot tells how Nadila, a young woman with little experience of reading literature critically, searching for a purpose, how she became a writer thanks to Clarice Lispector. Clarice is variously portrayed as saint, tormentor, role model, life coach. There are serious points to be made in this novel about body image and mental illness, for example, but the overall tone is playful and self-deprecating, as are the cartoons, emojis, and photographs dotted through it. The stylistic experiments, drama, interview, emails, show Nadila's self-motivated apprenticeship to Lispector, which goes through several phases, including attempted enforced assimilation, when she copies out whole short stories, and rejection. She even imagines a cowboy-style face-off. The symmetry changes as Nadila gains in confidence and learns how to bring her writing and her sense of self under control, fulfilling the challenge she set at the beginning of the novel. I will write myself. By the end, the pupil / reader has become a writer. The proof is in our hands. But Lispector still remains elusive. And here I'm going to quote, "Who was Clarice? Was I really paying homage to her? No, if I was honest. Under the guise of talking about my favourite writer, I was really just exhibiting myself." Carrero's novel captures the magical process by which readers become enchanted by a particular writer and inspired to write themselves by themselves. She uses different sets of metaphors to describe the process, some alluding to religious devotion, others to the conceptual and physical internal disturbances that reading Lispector causes her. These are fantastic. I felt exhausted and full. Something had boiled over inside me, and I would have to wait before ingesting a single word more. What I had read, what I hadn't even comprehended and had no wish to understand, had in equal parts delighted and nauseated me. Who had put a washing machine inside me? I suddenly wondered. A woman in there had turned it on. Instead of clothes, it was washing thoughts, words, ideas, dreams, desires, and oh, how it hurt when it was time to spin dry. Vertigo, disorientation, confusion, loose letters, chains, condemnations, links, interlineations. I could see it all, but how to express it, even to myself? Lispector's last apparition is sparked when Nadila reads Un sopro di vida, A Breath of Life, and they discuss the relationship between author and character. Of course, ironically, both of them are both authors and characters who wrote about authors and characters. By the end of this last staged conversation, it seems that Lispector has talked Nadila out of ending her life. Effectively, she has saved her reader's life. I've jumped over one of the slides there, so could you move forward? Yes, lots of quotations, so could you move to the last slide, please? So to conclude, in her Afterlives, Lispector is a benign spirit. She's reincarnated fictionally so frequently because she's very real and alive to her readers. Her own texts are open, not just receptive to multiple interpretations, but also because her narrators give the impression of exposing their deepest selves. The writers who have incorporated her into their fiction have followed Derrida's exhortation in Spectres of Marx to not just speak of the spectre, but to speak to it and with it. The sheer number, international reach, and variety of literary responses to Clarice Lispector, the woman and the writer, in the 40 years since her death, are testimony to the power of her impact on readers and her legacy. They show a desire to extend and enhance her life, because the meaning of her writing and her life go beyond the limits of her 57-year lifespan. They complement the existing biographies and literary critical research on her work, offering glimpses of what might have been and material proof that she lives on through her words and her readers. In fact, the very act of reading can be considered a form of afterlife if we equate the act of writing to life, and we readers have the power to reincarnate her. As Ferreira Goulart, poet and art critic and a friend of hers, wrote, remembering his dear Clarice, não obstante, era tudo o que valia a pena fazer na vida, conforme afirmou, quando não escrevo estou morta. Em compensação, quando a lemos, ressuscita. You're on mute, Julia.
2 years of this and I still haven't learned. Let me put Adriana on. Thank you for this very inspiring talk. I did not know that Lispector was a character in so many literary texts that I thought all of them were very, very, actually they're very playful, you know, and an homage, but also they talk a lot to Clarice's readership, I think. How people feel when they read Clarice Lispector and this whole fan club that exists around her. Thank you so much for that. We have a few questions coming in, but before we open to questions, I would like to start. Both of your talks were so interesting, and I think they were very innovative in terms of literary criticism and readings of Clarice Lispector's works. So I would like to ask Adriana a question first, and then afterwards I'll ask Claire my questions. But to Adriana, so I was actually wondering, I think it was really interesting how you showed the ways that the Hebrew translations of Lispector unpack Judaism in her writing. And although you spoke more of A Hora da Estrela, which is the most explicit Judaist text, I would like to know if this kind of reading and what you called, I think it was a Jewish ethical reading, if this also appears in the translation of Laços de Família in the same volume, and how does it appear?
I can't quite answer that for any of the other works, because I didn't really spend a lot of time trying to go through all the Hebrew translations. And I also, I mean, my sense is that in some ways, I don't think this works with all the texts. I think there's something very specific about this particular novella. I think in Hour of the Star, because the Hour of the Star is, I think, very much preoccupied with a kind of ethical reading, then it sort of makes sense that when it's translated into Hebrew, and I'm going to suspect into other languages and other script worlds, this ethical reading also needs to be translated in some way. And so, but I do think that when something is, I have to be careful because I don't think that Hebrew is necessarily or has to be a Jewish language. I mean, there are non-Jewish people who, including myself, who speak Hebrew and write in Hebrew and create literary works in Hebrew. But that because Hebrew has such a long history as as the language of Jewish texts and Jewish liturgical texts, and of course we have the Hebrew Bible, that it's inevitable, I think, that when a work is translated into Hebrew, it's going to carry with it echoes of these texts, whether it wants to or not, just because of the way Hebrew words circulate in this Jewish textual tradition. So I think in some ways, I think Miriam Tivon is a very prolific translator. I was not able to find a single article or interview where she talks about her translation process. The only thing I found was a short interview where she said she basically doesn't like talking about these things theoretically. She's a professional literary translator. She made a living off, she's now retired, but that was her living. So she would translate works very quickly and bring them out. And so so I also don't want to necessarily ascribe to her a kind of intentional practice of translating towards a Jewish ethical reading. Just that I, as a reader of Hebrew, I picked this up and I thought it was interesting just to think about the way that when Lispector's work is translated into Hebrew, it gets pulled into what I call kind of the orbit of the Jewish textual tradition. And rachamim is just such an interesting word because it's like a straightforward translation of piedagi, except the word itself takes us into this whole textual and liturgical world. And again, I don't know to what extent that's intentional on the translator's part, but I think as readers, we're also inventing texts when we're reading. And so it would be interesting to see how this works with other Hebrew translations. The volume does include chapters by, one chapter by Yael Segalovitz, who's translated Avia Crucis do Corpo. And I think she talks there about the concept of mistakes within a Jewish exegetical context. So I think her chapter, just no spoilers, but I think there she goes into what we could call a kind of Jewish reading through different works. Sorry, so it's not a direct answer to your question, but that's the best I can do.
Yeah, that's actually very interesting because so before I move on to Claire, I'm just gonna ask another question. Is this? I was wondering if this take on Lispector's works that regards Judaism in her texts, and especially out of the Estrela, but I think other chronicles as well, right? Is this a line of criticism that of literary criticism that has become more prominent in the 21st century? How can you? I don't know if you can pinpoint some of these critics who read Lispector in this way, and whether these readings, whether they are more connected to the reception of Lispector abroad, because I don't see them so often in the Brazilian context.
Well, I'd love to hear what Claire thinks about this, but I'll venture also an answer. So when I came across the Hebrew translation of Ahora da Estrela, which was and remains like my absolute favorite book in the world, and I read it in English, and I grew up speaking Spanish, so I can sort of navigate Portuguese texts. But I wouldn't say, as you can tell from my speaking, I'm not comfortable speaking Portuguese because I just end up doing it as Spanish. But later I read it in Portuguese and then read it later in Hebrew. But when it came out in Hebrew, so it was at the end of the 90s, and I think Jewish readings of Lispector had already emerged. But a lot of these readings, and I talk about this in the chapter, were really invested in trying to sort of decide whether or not she was really Jewish in a sort of observant way. It was mostly focused, I think, on the biographical. And I think this was also kind of the issue with Moser's biography, Benjamin Moser's biography, that it's invested in trying to determine how much of her own life was influenced by Judaism and to what extent she identified as Jewish. And I'm less interested in this. And I actually think that in the volume, that's sort of, Claire and I sort of observed that there's a different kind of intervention into the whole question of Jewish Lispector and to what extent her works are Jewish. And that translation is a big part of that. And I think instead of focusing on the author as a human being, it's more thinking about sort of how the texts themselves open up the possibility for these kinds of readings, and to what extent the readers are creating that reading, and to what extent translation is also creating that kind of reading. So I think, I think that the tendency with Lispector is to see, is not to do that kind of close reading of the translations, because I think there's still a tendency in literary studies to give primacy to the original language and original text. But I think that in our volume, we are attentive to the way translations themselves need to be read closely, and what the translation of Lispector into Hebrew, into Chinese, into other languages reveals, in what way it sort of illuminates something that's already present in the original, or actually creates something. And in that sense is, I think, connecting to Claire's work on the afterlife. So I would say the big shift is moving from like thinking of Judaism in terms of Lispector as in terms of her biography, and shifting that focus more into ways of reading and ways of translating. But Claire may have also another perspective on this as well.
Well, I'm just thinking about researchers who've worked specifically on Judaism, and the big name I think is Nelson Vieira, who is also in our volume, not writing about Jewishness here, but in our volume, but he's published several works on Clarice in Portuguese and in English, and he's a professor, retired professor at Brown University in the States, and I'm sure that his work has had repercussions and encouraged people to read more about her. I'm trying to think about other. I think there's a collection of articles edited by Regina Zilberman, from Rio Grande do Sul, but I can't remember the title of it. And I'm sure there are several articles about Jewishness and Jewish heritage and Jewish influence on her work in that collection. Whether it, but I'm not sure how she is studied in Israel or in Jewish communities through these translations. Or in other languages. It'd be interesting to find out.
Yes.
Can I just say,
yes,
I just want to add one thing. Just that I think it also, there's a feedback loop that happens with, or has happened with Jewish readings of Lispector, which is with Ahora da Estrela, all the focus is on Maccabea's name, because it's the most explicit Jewish reference. And so what fascinated me when it's translated into Hebrew is that Maccabea becomes almost the least explicit Jewish reference. And so then it's interesting to go back to the original, as it were, and to speculate to what extent we're missing kind of less explicit references, because we're so invested in sort of what is visible. And so one of the things that was interesting to me is how many articles would just give you kind of the same rehashing about the name Maccabea. And I'm like, and then they would often read it in the exact same way. Whereas Yael Segalovitz, who is in our volume and wrote an introduction to the reissue of the Hebrew translation, breaks it down even further. So there's so much more you could be doing with the name Maccabea if you're thinking about it in terms of Hebrew, and not just in terms of a Jewish word. So that's the other thing, is to be attentive to the language itself, which I think is something that was missing a bit.
No, that's really interesting, especially when you mentioned that her translations are, let's say, a means of afterlives. I think that's a very good point, right? Especially because she has got several new translations in the last decade, I imagine, with Roser's biography. And so, Claire, I would like to ask you to talk a little bit about this, because from the volume that you organized, you and Adriana organized, I have the feeling that there's also a mapping of how Lispector appears not only to readers but to critics in the 21st century. And I don't know, I have a hunch that there is a shift from the predominant reading in the last decades of the 20th century, which was a feminist reading, women's writing and so on. So could you perhaps comment a little bit on the relationship between this shift in criticism, but also in how this contributes to this afterlife and to these new Clarices that emerge?
I'll try. That's a lot.
That's a big question.
But yeah, we were certainly trying to find new angles from which to approach Clarice, or which others had already started to use to approach Clarice. And I think she's not unique, but she's a very she's a writer whose works are open, accessible, ambiguous, and that helps with critical theory. So as different waves of critical theory become popular and ebb and flow, many critics try to apply them to Clarice's work, and often in very fruitful ways. So she's perfect for a feminist reading, because there are so many female characters and they are struggling against various forms of oppression. But there have also been post-structuralist readings of Clarice. There seems to be now, moving into the 21st century, and post-human and non-human reading theory is popular with some critics, and that is something that can be applied to her works, and affect theory as well. So I think her work lends itself to multiple readings. It's quite incredible. It's this kaleidoscopic nature of it that means that there's something for every reader, from the most humble reader who wants a good story. Well, maybe they're not always good stories in terms of action and plot, but there's something for everybody to feel a connection to. And can you remind me what the end of your question was?
How this contributes to this afterlife of Clarice Lispector.
Yes. Well, I suppose every text written about her is a form of afterlife, the critical readings as well. Although that's not something I've been looking at, purely fictional readings. But I'm sure readers who read the criticism and the literary criticism and the critical theory, when it's applied to Clarice, it can be a kind of a gateway into wanting to know more about her, and then wanting to read everything she's ever written. So I can't give you any specific examples, but the more that's written about her, the more ripples spread across the surface of the water and she reaches more people.
Thank you. So I'm going to read a few questions that we got here. So I have a question. I have two questions from a viewer who is called Dot and Kangaroo. I don't know your name, I'm so sorry. So I just have your pseudonym. Okay, so the first part of the question is here. Clarice came of age during the Vargas dictatorship when anti-Semitism was rampant. It was either promoted by the government or far-right movements such as the Integranist Alliance and so on. Could Professor Jacobs discuss the extent to which such anti-Semitism impacted on Lispector's intellectual and literary development?
I can try. I mean, I should say a lot of this is, I think, speculative, but what we do know is that the Lispector family made its way to Brazil, not necessarily by choice. So they were refugees, and the family had been fleeing pogroms and intense and violent anti-Semitism in what is now Ukraine. And so I think that I'm going, and again, I mean, we know what we know about Jewish immigration in the early 20th century. A great deal of it is impelled by anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish violence specifically. So I think that it's not unusual that Lispector would have kept some of that part of her life very private. But I think we also it's tricky because we also know she was really fascinated in the occult and in Christianity. So maybe she had, very kind of syncretic kind of spiritual practice, and one that was idiosyncratic and very personal. And that could have also accounted for her desire to make these sort of references less explicit. But I also suspect that it has to do, and maybe this goes back to the question about sort of why her fiction activates these multiple transcreations of her life and writings, as the question, one of the questions in the comments posed it. That I think as a writer, the more explicit you are about who you are in your writing, the more there's a tendency for then readers to receive it in terms of your biography, in terms of your identity. And Lispector clearly resisted this kind of reading of her work. And so I think that also if we struggle to find sometimes these signposts of identity, it's because she's not giving them to us, because she doesn't want our readings to be narrowed down necessarily in that way. So it's tricky. I think I'm not surprised that she didn't make that part of her life public. I think also given the anti-Semitism and discrimination against Jewish communities in Brazil, it's not unusual that Jewish life would have had this kind of internal, very active existence within the Jewish community bubble, but then the Jewish individuals would have had this, life outside of it that didn't necessarily integrate the two. But I think when it comes to Lispector, I think there's more to it. So yeah, thank you for the question. I think that's part of the thing that my own chapter struggles with a little bit is precisely kind of where we draw that line with her.
Yes. Yeah. Sorry, Claire, would you like to say something?
I was just going to say that in the Gelfenbein book, she kind of goes where she invents situations which may have happened to Clarice, but we don't know about them. So dinner parties at which people made anti-Semitic comments or refused to sit next to the character who is playing out Clarice's life. who knows? I mean, we've got the biographies, we've got biographical information about, and we've got sort of testimonials from her colleagues and friends, one of whom said, went to the funeral and said, "I never realized that she was Jewish." And other people must have known automatically that she was Jewish. So how much did she present it in interviews? I don't think she sort of offered the information, but if people asked, she wasn't going to deny it. You know, it was just part of her that she perhaps didn't feel she needed to project or promote.
Yes.
I mean, also in the late 1930s and 1940s, of course, being Jewish was extremely difficult, and as your contributor said, Vargas, there were a lot of sympathizers in the Vargas regime, so it was not a time to actively sort of express one's Jewishness. It was a difficult time, obviously.
Yes, and I think this also touches upon the issue between, with the tension between life and work, right, in Lispector. Because as Adriana says in her chapter, from what I understood, it was, she struggled not to go with this biographical interpretation of her Jewishness and how it plays out in her in her novel. And at the same time, it feels that, you know, she was extremely enigmatic. I think all biographers would agree on that. And at the same time, I think what has been created around Clarice as Lispector as a person, a lot of it comes from the chronicles, right? Because these chronicles are in the first person. So, you know, and they're in the newspapers every day. So there is this connection between, you know, fiction and fact. So there is this writer who's explicitly telling us about her life, although she wasn't. We don't know if she really was, right? And I think that's so fascinating about how her work.
Yeah, I've just been teaching Machado de Assis and thinking about the first person narrator and how convincing, how compelling and persuasive he is. And yet we know that Machado's narrators are definitely not him. So that's just anecdotal.
Yeah. Yes, and we're not so sure with Clarice Lispector. And then sometimes I keep thinking, you know, because she was so discreet and she did not, it's very hard to find moments in which she openly talks about her life. So it's interesting. What I found really interesting about both of your talks is how, I don't know, she passed away in 1979, wasn't it? So it's 1977. So 40 years, I'm terrible at math. We're still trying to kind of get these pieces together. And this question, you know, who was this woman? And which is a question that the biographers have always have also tried to address. And then again, it's really important to read Lispector's work without her persona, because they exist, you know, for themselves. I don't know what you think about this. This perhaps an overt emphasis on who she really was and what she really did, and the separation from the literary work.
Do you want to start? Or oh, you want me to?
You go first.
Yeah, I think something that comes up in our introduction, but also something we talked about a great deal, is the feeling that if you ask any of the contributors, including yourself, Julia, what brought, sort of it to tell us the moment you sort of encountered Clarice. Everyone remembers this moment. It's like a core memory, and it's very personal. So I think there's something about her, especially, and for those who work on her, or write about her or reinvent her, that feels very intimate. And I think that that intimacy is what pulls us in and gets us engaged. But it's tricky too, because sometimes I think it can feel sometimes like you're working on the writings of your best friend. But the reality is, I never knew her. I know personally she died a year after I was born. But sometimes when I'm working on her, I feel like she's there. And so one of the things that's fascinating is that a lot of scholars who kind of Lispector scholars will refer to her as Clarice. They'll use the first name, and I think that's how she's referred to in Brazil. And her translators into English all write about her as, but I've never been able to do that. And I think part of it is that I've tried to always referring to her as Lispector, both in my academic writing and when I talk about her, it's trying to kind of keep a little bit of that distance that I think I need so that I avoid becoming too personal in my engagements with her. But one of the things we did in the volume is we're sort of letting everyone decide how they want to refer to her. So some people refer to her throughout as Clarice, others like me use Lispector. And we do talk about that in the introduction and how that connects to this idea of intimacy and that blurred line between life and work that tends to happen a great deal when you're writing about Lispector.
Yeah, I would second that. I sometimes feel I know more about, like, she's a member of my family. I know more about her than I do about some of my relatives, because I've been impelled and compelled to want to know more. Because I feel she knows me, and I want to know more about her. And because letters aren't kept and things are thrown away, and because she was so discreet, I think she curated her image in interviews very carefully, and said certain things, and she had to do interviews if she was, trying to promote books and things like that. But there were things she wouldn't say, and she sort of. Then there are those kind of paradoxical interviews at the end of her life, especially the filmed one, the TV Cultura one, where she's there and she's being asked questions, and she says, now quiero responder, or I'm not answering that question. So it's like she's halfway there, but she's not giving anything. And in her books, she gives so much they're so open in that way. And there is, how much about the life do you bring in? I've been teaching Laços de Família this term, as well as Machado de Assis, and I tried to give a little bit of context about what the world was like in the 1950s, because it's changed a lot. That's when she was writing, but at the same time, she wasn't. And I think the Laços de Família stories feed. You can look at them alongside the writing for the women's pages, because a lot of the characters in the stories are the kind of characters who would read those women's pages and buy the products advertised on the women's pages and wear those fashions and all that sort of thing. So there's ways of weaving it together, the life and the fiction, without thinking that every character is her. But I still want to know more about her as a person. So every biography that comes out, I'm there. I want to buy it. I want to know more. Every exhibition, I know there's an amazing exhibition on in Sao Paulo at the moment, and you can visit it on YouTube. But I want to be there, and I want to see Teresa Montero's new biography, which came out last week. I want to know more. And there aren't that many writers whose lives, maybe it's because there are gaps and because they're enigmatic, that we do want to know more, because we can't know more.
Yeah. No, this makes so much sense, because her writing is so intimate. So we create her readers create this relationship with her that you want to know more. And and we were talking about Montero's biography, and the new edition, digs into it more and more, and we have more other new interviews, a new video interview, which is very rare and nobody knew about. Didn't you know about this? Yes, there's a 6-minute interview that Teresa Montero found, and she used in her biography. That's why I said Teresa is an archaeologist. She really is, because she finds she found so many important documents, her contribution, and she found this interview now, which I'm very curious. I haven't watched it, but there have been several articles about it. So since we're getting into the topic of the biographies, we have another question from Dot and Kangaroo. How important is Moser's biography for Lispector's reception abroad? Brazilian scholars tend to loathe it.
Claire, I'll start just with because so I guess it's not surprising that, so basically in my chapter, I go into this a little bit, that Miriam Tivon came out with these, a few translations of Lispector's work in the late 90s. And the Israeli publisher and editor, Moshe Peli, was like, we're going to bring out more translations of Lispector's work. Because in Israel, basically, the Hebrew translation of Jewish authors is very active. So for Jewish Israeli readers, the fact that Lispector came from a Jewish family and is a major writer would be already enough to sort of motivate the Hebrew translation of the work. It's about creating kind of a Jewish bookshelf in Hebrew translation. So in Israel, she is also read very much as a Jewish writer, just by virtue of that heritage. But then no other translations came out for many years. And then Benjamin Moser's biography comes out, and suddenly there's this flurry of reissues and new translations. And I think that's because of the way that Moser's biography, I would say problematically, but nonetheless delved into the family's Judaism and Jewish history. And so I think that kind of also reinvigorated some interest in her work, and then these Hebrew translations came out. So if you look in the Hebrew press in Israel, when the biography comes out, there's like an interview with Moser, there are like articles and reviews of the biography. And at that moment I was like, okay, something's going to happen, because it sparked people's interest in it and her work again. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's very accessible, and it provides a lot of contextual information about Brazilian history. So I think it's very readable for Anglophone readers who may know very little about Brazilian culture. And I think so there are readers who are academic or feminist readers, or who have come across Lispector and I'm sorry. On one hand, and then there are people who are interested in Latin America, or women, interesting women in history, who will come to the biography first and then discover the fiction. Undoubtedly, it has had a knock-on effect in the biography and the new translations by New Directions and Penguin, because they've, especially the ones the books which weren't available before, because suddenly now we have access to everything in very up-to-date translations, and there have been knock-on effects in other languages. Undoubtedly, it's had an effect.
Yeah, and I think the fact that it's in English, you know, this global language, for better or for worse. So of course, in Israel, it's not been translated into Hebrew. In English, there are English language readers in Israel, whereas I think Portuguese language biographies that preceded Moser's were less likely to find their way to a wide swath of Israeli readers by virtue of being in Portuguese, which would have a much smaller readership in Israel. So I think also there, it's like the politics of Anglophone translation and Anglophone writing in general plays a part as well.
Yeah, I think it's been translated into Spanish, definitely, and French, and other languages I haven't.
German, I think Dutch as well. It was widely translated.
Mm-hmm. And on the back of that, also the correspondencias or minhas queridas certainly exist in French.
Thank you. So Dot and Kangaroo also asked where can we watch that video? I don't think it's available online. I think it's in an archive. I read it in the newspaper. So we have to wait to see if someone publishes it for us online so we can watch it. We have another question from Louisa. Regarding scholars referring to the author as Clarice, do you think it's possible that this is also related to how scholars refer to female authors more personally than they refer to male authors?
I don't know. I mean, in being a very reserved English scholar, I was trained to refer to all authors by their surnames, and then I really don't know if it's a consistent thing. Somebody needs to do a doctorate on it and analyze the data.
I think it is true that there's a tendency sometimes to refer to female authors as by their first name. This also happens in academic contexts. I can't tell you how many times sometimes I'll get an email. It's like, you know, dear Mrs. Jacobs or dear Adriana, and then my male colleague is, you know, distinguished professor, esteemed so-and-so. And so I think I can definitely, I think that's a fair sort of reading of that. I think with Clarice, though, it's a little different. I sometimes think it's the way we refer to Dante, you know, for instance, as Dante, or you know, all, you know, Homer is Homer. And it's almost like the mononym is that kind of sign of respect as well as intimacy. And I should also say that in the Hebrew context, the use of mononyms is actually not unusual at all, and it's considered like highly respectful, because if you, and this happens with a few female poets. So there's a poet named Rachel, who's known as Rachel, but Rachel, if you're saying it with an Anglophone pronunciation. But her name was Rachel Bluestein. But why do people say Rachel? Because she was sort of this major poet. So it's like there can be no other. So I think, so I don't want to go too far on one side or the other, but it's just something we were attentive to in the volume. And the more time I spent with Lispector scholars, I also feel like I can also claim a bit of that intimacy for myself. I don't have to be so shy about it. So sometimes I'll say Clarice when I'm just feeling closer to her in some way, and try not to be afraid of showing a bit of my emotional side as an academic as well.
Yeah, I think I tend to speak about her as Clarice and maybe write about her as Lispector.
Yes, I have that feeling as well. And also, I think even in Portuguese, I recently learned that some authors will be, for example, Essa de Queiroz, he will be referred to as Essa. There was another example I had in mind. And I think Clarice Lispector is this very particular case as well. There is this notion of intimacy, but at the same time, it's just how her, her authorial name circulates, let's say. So literatura clariciana. I mean, in Portuguese, I don't think we would say literatura lispectoriana. I think it would be clariciana. Thank you for your question, Luisa. And then I have a question that we do have time for one more question, do we? Yeah, okay. Just one more question. And I'm going to take Thiago's question, which you've already answered, but I'm going to attach a question to it. Because he asked, could we speculate on what are the features, themes, narrative strategies, etc., of Lispector's fiction that activate the multiple transcreations of her life and writings? And then I would add another follow-up question, which is, which I found one of the most interesting aspects of your volume is how you brought together also music and other forms of interpretation of Lispector's work. And I specifically remember music, and I also remember a chapter, if I'm not mistaken, that someone was writing about the memes in which Lispector appears. Could you comment a little bit on that? I think that we can, this will be our last question. I don't want to take too much of your time.
Yes, I'm trying to think of could you put the question back up? Thank you. The features of her fiction that activate the multiple transcreations rather than her life. And I've just seen in the chat, yeah, Camilo is another one, another man who's referred to by his first name. But Essa is Joaquim Maria, and nobody calls him Joaquim or Maria. Just like Machado de Assis, he's also Joaquim Maria, I think, isn't he? Or Maria Joaquim. But what are the features that activate it? Well, I have to think about that. I don't know if Adriana has an answer.
Well, I think in your presentation and chapter, you really take us on this very close reading journey through the fictional afterlives, and sort of part of what and the reasons why her work kind of invites that is really an invitation to create something new that's both a continuation of, but also distinct from the writing that inspires it. But I think to the question, Julia, that you added, sort of the inclusion of so one of Claire's former students, is a musician and had written a song. Actually, I think it was a song that's inspired by Lispector's writing, and we included that. We have poetry by Adriana X. We have personal essays, some memoir. So the only thing that was missing, we have one chapter that delves into the Susana Amaral film version of A Hora da Estrela, includes stills. We encouraged the use of images, but the memes was a really fun, challenging chapter to work with. And that's
translating
yeah,
more fruity
it was really exactly kind of. So that's Karen Mota's piece, and that's really interesting, just seeing how readers will just take quotes completely, sometimes just disconnected or from her writing, and they take on lives of their own, and sometimes they invent things. And I think what was important for us to include this kind of work is to also kind of push back a little bit on sort of what we think of as like the forms of academic or scholarly engagement, and that a song lyric can constitute a really valuable and interesting and new reading or interpretation of her work that challenges us in different ways. And that not everything has to be necessarily an academic chapter with an argument and claims. And even within the academic, the more kind of scholarly chapters, we were really open to people trying out different things. So for instance, my chapter doesn't really have like a thesis statement. I just wanted to try to get to the scholarly reading through different ways. And I think also that's part of what she inspires us as a writer to do, to think outside the box. So it's an academic volume that does not have pieces that we traditionally think of as academic. And even the academic pieces are taking risks. And I think for us, that is part of what we think of as the 21st century rereading of Lispector, is one that opens up new forms of engagement.
Would you like to add something, Claire?
I suppose it's that intimacy leads to people to write about her and even to start writing. So the Soy una caja, the Catalan novel, is about someone who's never thought about writing before. Well, she's tried to write, but she hasn't been able to find her voice. And it's through reading Clarice, immersing herself in Clarice's writing, transcribing whole swathes of novels, and kind of trying to, by osmosis almost, become a writer like Clarice, that she does get the confidence to write. So the fact that Clarice was able to write something like Agua Viva, which is like a collage of so many different voices and ideas and styles, or something like Ahora da Estrella, which has 14 titles, you know, something like that. That seeing someone blaze a trail like that is hugely inspiring and empowering, as well as the intimacy of thinking, well, there's somebody who understands me. I've felt like that, and she's been able to write about it, and that makes me feel understood. It makes me feel kind of held and part of there's a connection there. It makes me feel stronger. Now I can write. Now I can make a decision. Now I can break with that man who is no good. Any of these things. I think she's empowering in that way.
Perfect, thank you. So Dot and Kangaroo asks, will the book be translated into Portuguese?
We would love that to happen one day. Some of the articles, some of the chapters did start out in Portuguese. So this will be a kind of like a ricochet effect. Or we'll maybe ask them to, we'll go back to the originals. But yeah, that would be wonderful. It would be wonderful.
It is a wonderful book. I can't wait to read it.
It's massive, by the way. It's how many chapters, Adriana? 28?
28 chapters. I think it's going to be over 400 pages. So,
wow.
Yeah.
But very exciting. Thank you so much. I think, we can stop here. Okay. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you so much for accepting our invitation. It was lovely talking to you. I just can't wait for the book to come out. I really want to read it. It's really great. Thank you so much, Claire and Adriana, for being here.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you for all the inches. Thank you for the questions.
Yes. Thank you for everyone who bared with us here, and we look forward to seeing you in the following events. Don't forget to fill out the form, the presence form. And if you need a certificate, or if you want a certificate, please do send us an email. Thiago will write it down here. I must admit that I forgot the email, but it's no problem. Thiago will write it down here. Thank you so much for coming, and we look forward to seeing you in the upcoming events. Thank you, Claire. Thank you, Adriana.